My wife cheated emotionally for years, diminished me, controlled me, and tried to rewrite who I was. Until I walked away, revealed the truth, and reclaimed the life she never bothered to see. Seattle's mornings always carried a certain damp weight, the kind that clung to your jacket and made you feel the city's pulse before you'd even had your coffee. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of his front porch, staring at the drizzle that blurred the outlines of Capitol Hill's tidy row houses. At 42, he was lean but not lanky, with a face that could pass for younger if not for the faint lines etched around his hazel eye. His dark hair was swept back, just long enough to hint at a quiet rebellion against the corporate buzz cuts he'd once worn. He adjusted his scarf, slung a leather messenger bag over his shoulder, and stepped into the mist. To the neighbors, Ethan was a familiar shadow, a polite nod, a quick wave, the guy who always seemed to be heading somewhere but never lingered long enough to chat. They knew him as Madison's husband, the reserved half of a couple that seemed to balance each other out. Madison Cole was the one who lit up block parties, her laughter spilling over like champagne, her stories about event planning for Seattle's elite always landing with just the right mix of charm and name-dropping. Ethan, though, he was the guy in the background, smiling softly, holding her coat. Inside their craftsman-style home, the morning had unfolded with its usual rhythm. Madison was at the kitchen island, her blonde hair pulled into a messy bun, scrolling through her phone while a podcast blared about scaling your hustle. She wore a tailored blazer over yoga pants, ready to pivot from breakfast to a client meeting without missing a beat. Ethan moved around her, quiet as a ghost, pouring coffee into a travel mug. "You're out early again," Madison said without looking up, her voice carrying a faint edge like she was testing him for a response. "I got a meeting," Ethan replied, his tone even, almost too neutral. He rinsed a plate and set it in the dishwasher. She glanced at him, her blue eyes narrowing slightly. "You always have a meeting. What is it this time? Spreadsheets, numbers? God, Ethan, don't you ever get bored?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he wiped his hands on a dish towel, his movements deliberate. "It's just work," he said finally, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Madison sighed, already back to her phone. "Whatever, just don't forget we're hosting the Lamberts tomorrow. Try to be, I don't know, interesting?" Ethan nodded, grabbed his keys, and slipped out the door. The drizzle greeted him like an old friend, cool and indifferent. He didn't mind the rain. It gave him an excuse to keep his head down, to move through the world without being noticed. Not that anyone looked too closely. To Madison, to their friends, to the barista who handed him his coffee every morning, Ethan Cole was a financial analyst, steady, reliable, the kind of guy who probably spent his days crunching numbers in a cubicle, his life as predictable as the gray Seattle sky. The truth was something else entirely. Ethan's office wasn't a cubicle. It wasn't even an office, not in the way most people pictured one. Tucked away in a sleek, glass-walled building in South Lake Union, Cole Ventures occupied the top 3 floors, its name etched in understated steel above the entrance. The fintech company had started as a late-night idea in Ethan's grad school dorm, a way to make investing accessible, transparent, human. Now it was a powerhouse, with a valuation that made headlines in Forbes and a client list that included half the tech giants in the Pacific Northwest. Ethan wasn't just part of it. He was its founder, its CEO, its beating heart. He never talked about it, not at home, not at dinner parties, not even when Madison's friends asked what he did for a living. "Finance," he'd say, and they'd nod, already losing interest. It wasn't a lie, not exactly, but it was a shield. Ethan had learned early on that success came with strings, expectations, envy, assumptions about who you were supposed to be. He didn't want that. What he wanted, what he'd always wanted, was to be seen for who he was, not what he'd built. The elevator dinged, and Ethan stepped into the office. The space was open and bright, with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the Puget Sound. Employees milled about, some huddled over laptops, others laughing over coffee. They greeted him with nods and smiles, not the stiff deference you'd expect for a CEO, but something warmer, more personal. Ethan had a way of making people feel valued, like their ideas mattered as much as his own. It was why they stayed, why they believed in him. "Morning, boss," said Priya, his CTO, as she fell into step beside him. She was in her 30s, sharp-eyed and perpetually caffeinated, carrying a tablet like it was an extension of her arm. "You ready for the board meeting? They're going to grill us on the new app." Ethan loosened his scarf, his expression calm. "Let 'em grill. We've got the numbers to back it up." She grinned. "That's why I stick with you. Cool under fire." He chuckled, but it was soft, almost swallowed by the hum of the office. Cool under fire. If only they knew how often he felt the heat at home, how many nights he lay awake replaying Madison's words, wondering when he'd stopped being enough. Back at the house, Madison was already on her second call of the day, pacing the living room as she pitched a gala to a client. No, we can absolutely make it happen, she said, her voice bright with confidence. I've got the best team in the city. We'll blow them away. She hung up, tossed her phone onto the couch and caught her reflection in the mirror. She looked good, polished, in control, the kind of woman people noticed. It was a role she'd crafted carefully, one that felt more real than the small-town girl she'd been when she met Ethan 15 years ago. Back then, he'd been different too, quiet, sure, but with a spark that drew her in, a steadiness that made her feel safe. They'd promised each other the world, no secrets, no egos, just them against whatever came. Now, though, she wasn't so sure. Ethan was still quiet, but it wasn't the same. It felt like he was hiding, like he'd checked out of their life together. She'd tried to pull him back, pushing him to talk, to engage, to be someone her friends could admire, but he just retreated further. It frustrated her, the way he seemed content to fade into the background. Didn't he want more? Didn't he see how hard she was working to build something they could both be proud of? She picked up her phone again, scrolling through photos from their last vacation. There was Ethan, standing on a beach in Oregon, his hands in his pockets, looking out at the waves. He was smiling, but it was that same guarded smile he always wore now, like he was holding something back. Madison sighed and tossed the phone aside. Maybe tonight, at the dinner with the Lamberts, she'd get him to open up. Maybe she'd finally figure out what was going on in that head of his. Ethan didn't go straight home after work. He stopped at a bookstore in Pike Place, one of those cramped, cozy spots that smelled of paper and possibility. He wandered the aisles, his fingers trailing over spines until he found a worn copy of Walden. He'd read it in college, back when he thought simplicity was the answer to everything. Now, it felt like a reminder of something he'd lost. He bought the book and slipped it into his bag, then walked to a nearby cafe. Over a black coffee, he pulled out his journal, a small leather-bound thing he'd kept for years. He wrote in short, careful sentences, his handwriting neat but urgent. She thinks I'm nothing. Maybe I've let her. But I'm still here, still trying. How do you make someone see you when they've already decided who you are? He closed the journal and leaned back, staring out at the street. The rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and gleaming under the streetlights. For a moment, he imagined telling Madison everything, about the company, the late nights, the dreams he'd poured into it. But then he pictured her reaction, the way her eyes would widen, not with pride but with calculation, and he let the thought go. Ethan Cole wasn't invisible. He was just waiting, for what, he wasn't sure. But he knew one thing, he wasn't ready to stop being himself, not yet. The Lambert dinner was supposed to be a reset. Madison had spent the afternoon rearranging the dining room, swapping out the usual table runner for something crisp and white, setting out candles that smelled faintly of lavender. She'd curated the menu with the precision of a general planning a campaign. Roasted salmon, heirloom vegetables, a bottle of Pinot Noir she'd been saving for a night like this. Ethan watched her move through the house, her energy a whirlwind he no longer tried to match. He'd offered to help, but she'd waved him off with a tight smile. "Just don't disappear when they get here," she'd said, and he'd nodded, retreating to the kitchen to chop herbs. The Lamberts arrived at 7, their laughter spilling through the front door before they did. Tom Lambert was a real estate developer with a booming voice and a handshake that lingered too long. His wife, Claire, was a Pilates instructor whose Instagram feed was a kaleidoscope of sunsets and smoothie bowls. They were Madison's kind of people, bright, ambitious, always chasing the next big thing. Ethan greeted them with his usual quiet warmth, taking their coats, pouring wine, fading into the background as the conversation took off. Madison was in her element, steering the evening like a seasoned host. She told stories about her latest event, a tech conference with a drone light show that had everyone buzzing on social media. Tom leaned in, nodding appreciatively. "You're killing it, Madison," he said, raising his glass. "Not many people can pull that off." She beamed, but her eyes flicked to Ethan, who was slicing bread at the counter. "Well, someone's got to keep things exciting around here," she said, her tone light but pointed. The room laughed and Ethan offered a small smile, his knife moving steadily through the loaf. As the night wore on, the conversation shifted. Claire started talking about a friend who'd just sold his startup for millions. "He's what, 32? She said, her eyes wide. "Moved to Bali, bought a villa. Can you imagine?" Tom chuckled, swirling his wine. "That's the dream, right? Cash out, live big. Not all of us are cut out for that grind, though." He glanced at Ethan, who was clearing plates. "You're in finance, right, Ethan? Steady gig?" Ethan paused, his hands full of dishes. "Something like that," he said, his voice even. Madison's laugh cut through the air, sharp and sudden. "Steady's one way to put it," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Ethan's the king of predictable. I swear if I didn't push him, he'd never leave his desk." The table went quiet for a beat, the kind of silence that feels like a misstep. Claire sipped her wine, her eyes darting to Tom. Ethan set the plates in the sink, his movements slow, deliberate. "Someone's got to keep the lights on," he said softly, almost to himself. Madison didn't hear him, or if she did, she didn't care. She was already launching into a story about a client who'd flown her to Napa for a weekend consult. Later, when the Lamberts had gone and the house was still, Ethan stood at the sink, scrubbing dishes under the hum of the kitchen light. Madison came up behind him, her arms crossed. "You could have tried a little harder tonight," she said, her voice low. "They're important people, Ethan. You barely said a word." He kept scrubbing, the sponge moving in tight circles. "I was here," he said. "I listened." She sighed, sharp and exasperated. "That's not enough. You act like you're fine just existing. Don't you want more than this?" He turned off the faucet, drying his hands on a towel. For a moment he looked at her, really looked at her, searching for the woman who'd once stayed up with him until dawn, laughing over cheap wine and big dreams. She was still beautiful, still fierce, but there was a hardness in her eyes now, a hunger he didn't recognize. "I want us to be us," he said finally. "Like we promised." Madison's laugh was brittle. "That was a long time ago, Ethan. People change. Or at least, they're supposed to." He didn't answer. He folded the towel, set it on the counter, and walked upstairs. In their bedroom, he pulled out his journal and wrote, "She doesn't see me anymore. Maybe she never did, but I'm still here, and I'm not the one who's changed." The weeks that followed were a slow unraveling. Madison's comments grew sharper, her patience thinner. At breakfast, she'd question his choices, why he wore that jacket, why he hadn't pushed for a promotion, why he couldn't be more like the men she worked with, men who owned the room. Ethan absorbed it all, his silence a shield he'd honed over years. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he retreated inward, his journal filling with thoughts he couldn't say aloud. Flashbacks haunted him in quiet moments. He remembered their early days, when they were just two kids in love, scraping by in a tiny Belltown apartment. Madison had been a dreamer then, sketching out plans for a life full of adventure. Ethan had been her anchor, the one who made sure the rent was paid, the one who believed in her even when she doubted herself. They'd stood on a pier one night, the city glittering behind them, and promised to keep ego out of it, to build something real, together. No matter what, she'd said, her hand in his. He'd believed her. Now that promise felt like a ghost. Madison had taken over their finances, insisting she was better at it. She'd question every expense, every decision, as if Ethan's input was irrelevant. "I'm just trying to make sure we're secure," she'd say, but her tone implied he couldn't be trusted. He let her have it, not because he agreed, but because fighting felt like losing something he couldn't replace. At work, he was different. There, he was decisive, respected, the man who'd turned a dorm room idea into an empire. His team trusted him implicitly, leaning on his quiet confidence to navigate boardroom battles and market swings. But at home, he was shrinking, his voice drowned out by Madison's relentless need for more. One evening, he came home to find her sorting through a stack of bills, her laptop open to their bank account. "You spent $60 on coffee last month," she said without looking up. "60, Ethan. Do you even think about this stuff?" He stood in the doorway, his bag still slung over his shoulder. "I'll cut back," he said, his voice flat. She snorted, shaking her head. "It's not just the coffee, it's everything. You're so passive. I feel like I'm carrying us both." He looked at her, at the woman he'd once thought he'd spend forever with, and felt something shift inside him. Not anger, not yet. Just a quiet certainty that he couldn't keep doing this. He nodded, turned, and walked upstairs, his journal waiting like a confidant. That night, he wrote, "I'm not invisible. I'm just waiting for her to remember who I am. But what if she never does?" The air in the Cole household had grown heavy, like the pause before a storm. Ethan felt it every time he crossed the threshold, a subtle shift from the calm of the outside world to the tension that now defined home. Madison's words had become a constant hum, critiques disguised as suggestions, sighs that carried more weight than sentences. Ethan moved through it all with the same quiet resolve, his silence not surrender but survival. He told himself it was temporary, that she'd see him again, the way she used to. But doubt had started to creep in, a shadow that followed him from room to room. It was a Saturday, gray and unremarkable, when the dam finally broke. Ethan had spent the morning at a farmer's market, picking up groceries for the week, fresh kale, a loaf of sourdough, a jar of local honey. He'd lingered longer than necessary, chatting with a vendor about beekeeping, letting the mundane conversation anchor him. By the time he got home, the kitchen was empty, Madison's coffee mug abandoned on the counter, lipstick smudged on the rim. He unpacked the groceries, methodical as always, arranging everything in the fridge with a precision that felt like control. Madison appeared as he closed the fridge door, her phone in one hand, a frown already forming. "You went shopping?" she asked, her tone sharp, like he'd committed some small betrayal. Ethan nodded, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Thought I'd handle it this week." "Got your favorites." She crossed her arms, glancing at the counter where the empty canvas bag sat. "I had a list, Ethan. Did you even check it, or did you just grab whatever looked good?" He paused, caught off guard. "I got what we usually need: kale, bread, some fruit." "Kale?" She laughed, but it was cold, cutting. "I'm doing low carb this month, I told you that, and we're out of almond milk, which I specifically asked for." "You never listen." Ethan felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the urge to explain, to smooth things over. Instead, he took a breath, his voice steady. "I didn't see a list. If you've got one, I can go back." Madison shook her head, stepping closer, her eyes narrowing. "That's not the point. The point is you don't think. You just float through life doing the bare minimum, expecting me to pick up the slack. Do you know how exhausting that is?" The words landed harder than usual, each one a small jab that found its mark. Ethan stood there, the dish towel still in his hands, and something inside him shifted, not anger, not yet, but a clarity that had been building for months. "I'm not floating," he said quietly. "I'm trying, Madison. I've been trying." She scoffed, turning away, her voice rising. "Trying? You call this trying? I'm out there killing myself to build something, to make us look good, and you're… what, buying kale? You're so passive, Ethan. You'd fall apart if I left tomorrow." The room went still, the weight of her words hanging between them. Ethan looked at her, really looked, and saw someone he barely recognized. A woman who'd rewritten him in her mind, reduced him to a shadow of who he was. He set the towel on the counter, his movements slow, deliberate. "Let's test that," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. Madison froze, her eyes widening. "What?" Ethan didn't repeat himself. He turned, walked upstairs, and pulled a duffel bag from the closet. He packed with the same precision he'd used for the groceries: 2 pairs of jeans, a few shirts, his journal, a toothbrush. Madison followed him, her voice climbing with every step. "What are you doing?" "Ethan, stop. You're not serious." He zipped the bag, slung it over his shoulder, and faced her. She was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes now, something he hadn't seen in a long time. "I'm done being your punching bag," he said, not loud, not cruel, just final. "You want to see what happens without me? Fine." He brushed past her, down the stairs and out the front door. The drizzle had started again, cool against his skin, but he didn't stop to grab a jacket. His car was parked on the street, a modest sedan that blended into the neighborhood. He tossed the bag in the back seat and drove, the city blurring past him like a half-forgotten dream. Ethan didn't go far. Cole Ventures owned a corporate apartment downtown, a sleek, minimalist space meant for visiting execs or late-night work sessions. He'd never used it himself, but it was there, a key on his ring he'd almost forgotten. The building was quiet when he arrived, the lobby empty except for a security guard who nodded as he passed. The apartment smelled of clean linen and glass cleaner, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing the glittering skyline. Ethan dropped his bag on the floor and stood there, staring out at the city he'd helped shape, feeling the weight of his own absence. He didn't call anyone, didn't check his phone, though he knew it would light up soon enough. Instead, he pulled out his journal and wrote, the pen moving fast, the words spilling out like a release. "I left tonight, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. She thinks I'm nothing without her, but she's wrong. I've been carrying us both, and I'm tired. Maybe this is the end, maybe it's the start. Either way, I'm done pretending." He closed the journal and leaned back on the couch, the city's hum faint through the glass. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace, not happiness, not yet, but the quiet certainty that he'd finally chosen himself. Madison stood in the kitchen, staring at the counter where the canvas bag still sat. The house felt too big, too silent, the kind of quiet that presses against your skin. She'd tried calling him, once, twice, but it went straight to voicemail. "Ethan, come on," she'd said, her voice sharp with frustration. "This is ridiculous. Just come home." He didn't answer. She poured a glass of wine, her hands shaking slightly, and sat at the island, replaying the fight. She hadn't meant to push him that far. It was just groceries, just another small thing he'd gotten wrong. But the look in his eyes when he'd said, "Let's test that," calm, cold, certain, it unnerved her. Ethan didn't fight. He didn't leave. He was supposed to stay, to take it, to be there no matter what. She scrolled through her phone, pulling up photos, texts, anything that might anchor her. There was a picture from their last anniversary, both of them smiling at a restaurant, but even then, his smile had been guarded, like he was holding something back. She'd thought it was just him, just the way he was. Quiet, steady, predictable. But now, with the house empty and his bag gone, she wasn't so sure. Madison set the phone down, her reflection staring back from the dark screen. For the first time, she wondered if she'd misread him all along. The corporate apartment was too quiet, its stillness a stark contrast to the hum of Ethan's usual life. He woke early, the city still cloaked in pre-dawn gray, and lay on the couch staring at the ceiling. His phone sat on the coffee table, screen dark, untouched since he'd turned it off last night. No calls, no texts, no apologies to answer. For the first time in years, he felt the absence of expectation, and it was both unsettling and liberating. Ethan rose, splashed water on his face, and changed into a fresh shirt from his duffel. The mirror reflected a man he barely recognized, eyes tired but sharp, jaw set with a quiet resolve. He brewed coffee in the apartment's sleek machine, the routine grounding him, and by 6 a.m. he was out the door, heading to Cole Ventures. The streets of downtown Seattle were waking slowly, delivery trucks rumbling, baristas flipping signs to... Ethan walked with purpose, his breath visible in the chilly air, his bag slung over his shoulder like a lifeline. The office was already alive when he arrived, the hum of early risers filling the open space. Cole Ventures didn't feel like a corporation, it was a living thing, built on trust and ideas, and Ethan was its center. He stepped off the elevator, and heads turned, nods, smiles. A few quick mornings from developers hunched over monitors. Priya, his CTO, spotted him first, waving him over with a grin. "You're here early," she said, leaning against a standing desk, her tablet glowing with code. "Couldn't sleep? Or are you just that excited for the app demo?" Ethan set his bag down, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Something like that. Let's get the team together. Walk me through the latest." Priya raised an eyebrow, catching the edge in his voice but didn't press. She knew Ethan well enough to sense when he was carrying something heavy, and she respected his silence. They gathered in a glass-walled conference room, the team filtering in, engineers, designers, a data scientist who'd joined just last month. Ethan stood at the head of the table, not commanding but present, his calm focus pulling everyone in. The demo was a new feature for their investing app, a tool to help first-time users build portfolios with real-time guidance. The team presented with a mix of pride and nerves, knowing Ethan's eye for detail. He listened, asked questions, sharp but never cutting, his mind fully engaged. When a young designer stumbled over a UX flaw, Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady. "You're onto something here, but let's simplify the flow. Think about your mom using this." The room chuckled, tension easing, and the designer nodded, scribbling notes. Priya caught Ethan's eye, her expression saying what words didn't. "This is why they stay." He didn't micromanage, didn't posture. He saw people, not just their output, and they gave him their best because of it. By noon, the team had a plan to refine the feature, and Ethan felt a clarity he hadn't in months. Here, he wasn't invisible. Here, his voice mattered, not because of a title, but because of what he brought to the table. He joined the team for lunch at a food truck parked nearby, laughing over tacos as Priya recounted a coding disaster from her early days. For a moment, he was just Ethan, not a husband, not a target, just himself. Back at the office, he tackled emails, met with a client over video, and reviewed projections for the next quarter. Every task, every interaction reminded him of what he'd built. Not just a company, but a community that valued him. A junior analyst stopped by his desk, hesitant, asking for advice on a presentation. Ethan spent 20 minutes walking her through it, watching her confidence grow. When she thanked him, her gratitude was genuine, untainted by expectation, and it hit him harder than he expected. As the day wound down, Ethan stood by the windows, the Puget Sound shimmering under a rare break in the clouds. Priya joined him, sipping coffee, her usual energy softened. "You okay, boss?" she asked, direct but kind. He didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Getting there," he said finally, and she nodded, letting the silence hold. That evening, alone in the apartment, Ethan opened his journal. The words came slower this time, deliberate. "Today, I remembered who I am. Not what she thinks, not what anyone assumes, just me. I've been carrying her version of me for too long. Maybe it's time to let that go." He closed the book and looked out at the city, its lights steady and unjudging. The weight of home, of Madison's voice, felt distant, like a storm that had passed. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the stirrings of something new. Not peace, not yet, but possibility. Ethan's days in the corporate apartment settled into a rhythm, each one a step further from the life he'd left behind. He woke early, ran along the waterfront as dawn broke over Elliott Bay, and arrived at Cole Ventures before most of the team. Work was his anchor, the one place where he felt whole, where his choices carried weight without judgment. He didn't check his phone for Madison's calls, didn't open the texts that piled up, their notifications muted like a distant echo. For now, he needed space to breathe, to remember who he was without her voice reshaping him. It was midweek, a crisp Wednesday morning, when the past came crashing back. Ethan was in a conference room, sketching out a growth strategy on a whiteboard with Priya and 2 senior analysts. The room buzzed with ideas, the kind of creative chaos Ethan thrived on, markers squeaking, coffee cups scattered, laptops glowing with data. He was mid-sentence, gesturing at a graph, when the doors swung open with a force that silenced the room. Madison stood there, her blonde hair slightly disheveled, her eyes blazing. She wore a tailored coat over jeans, her purse clutched like a weapon. The receptionist trailed behind her, flustered. "Sir, I'm sorry," she insisted. "It's fine," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension. He set the marker down, his gaze steady on Madison. "Give us the room, please." Priya exchanged a glance with the analysts, her eyebrow raised, but they gathered their things and slipped out, the door clicking shut behind them. Madison didn't wait for silence. "You think you can just walk out and ignore me?" she said, her voice loud, sharp, filling the space. 3 days, Ethan, 3 days and not a single word. What the hell is wrong with you?" Ethan didn't flinch. He stood by the whiteboard, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "I needed space," he said simply. "I told you that." "Space?" Madison laughed, a brittle sound that echoed off the glass walls. "You don't get to just disappear because you're mad about some stupid fight. We're married, Ethan. You don't run away from that." He tilted his head, studying her, and for the first time he saw her not as his wife, but as a stranger. Someone who'd built a version of him that didn't exist. "I didn't run," he said. "I walked away. There's a difference." She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing, searching his face for the man she knew, the quiet, pliable Ethan who'd always come back. But he wasn't there, not anymore. "What is this?" she said, gesturing at the room, the office beyond. "You're acting like you're someone else, like you're above me now. Is this your little rebellion? Hiding out at your boring finance job?" The word boring hung in the air, and Ethan felt a flicker of something. Not anger, but clarity. He'd spent years letting her assumptions slide, shielding his truth to keep the peace. But the peace was gone, and so was his patience. "You don't know what I do, Madison," he said, his voice low, steady. "You never asked." She scoffed, crossing her arms. "Oh, please, I know exactly what you do. You sit in a cubicle, crunch numbers, come home and act like that's enough. Don't pretend you're some big shot now." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the glass wall, where the Cole Ventures logo gleamed in the morning light, the city sprawling beyond. "This isn't a cubicle," he said, turning to face her. "And I'm not a number cruncher. I built this company. I'm the CEO." The words landed like a thunderclap. Madison's mouth opened, then closed, her eyes darting from Ethan to the logo, the sleek office, the reality she'd never seen. "What?" she whispered, her voice cracking. You're lying. You're not." "I'm not lying," he said, and there was no triumph in his tone, no gloating, just fact. "Cole Ventures, my company. I started it, I run it. You assumed I was something else, and I let you. That's on me." Her face flushed, a mix of shock and fury. "You're the CEO, and you never told me? You let me think." She stopped, her hands balling into fists. "You lied to me, Ethan, for years." "I didn't lie," he said, his voice still calm, but there was steel beneath it now. "You never asked, you never cared enough to. You decided who I was, and I didn't fit into your story, so you stopped looking." Madison shook her head, pacing now, her heels clicking against the floor. "That's not fair. You hid this from me. You made me look like an idiot, bragging about my work while you were laughing behind my back." Ethan's eyes softened, but not with pity, with exhaustion. "I wasn't laughing. I was trying to be what you wanted, someone who didn't overshadow you, who didn't complicate your world. But I'm done with that." She stopped pacing, her gaze locked on him, and for a moment the room felt too small, the air too thin. "So what?" she said, her voice quieter now, almost desperate. "You're just going to throw it all away, us, because I didn't know you were some tech mogul?" He looked at her, really looked, and saw the woman he'd loved, the one he'd promised forever to. But that promise was a ghost now, buried under years of dismissal, of being unseen. "I'm not throwing anything away," he said. "You did that a long time ago." Madison's eyes glistened, but she blinked hard, refusing to let tears fall. "You're wrong," she said. but her voice trembled, less certain than before. "You'll see. You need me, Ethan. You'll come back." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The power had shifted, not because of his title or his wealth, but because he'd finally stopped letting her define him. She turned, her purse clutched tight, and walked out, the door closing with a soft thud. Ethan stood there, alone in the conference room, the whiteboard still marked with his notes. He picked up his journal from the table, flipped it open, and wrote, "She saw me today, but not the way I hoped, not as a partner, not as me, just as a threat to her story. I'm not going back, not to that." He closed the book, slipped it into his bag, and stepped back into the office. The team was waiting, their eyes curious but respectful, no one daring to ask. Priya caught his gaze, offered a small nod, and that was enough. Ethan Cole wasn't hiding anymore, not from her, not from anyone. The days after Madison's confrontation stretched into a strange new normal for Ethan. The corporate apartment, once a temporary refuge, began to feel like a home of sorts. Sparse, yes, but free of the weight he'd carried in Capitol Hill. He furnished it with small acts of reclamation, a second-hand bookshelf for his novels, a Bluetooth speaker for the jazz he'd loved in college, a yoga mat unrolled by the window where he stretched each morning. As the city woke, he was rebuilding, not just a space but himself, piece by deliberate piece. Madison, however, was not ready to let go. Her calls came like clockwork, morning, noon, evening, each one a variation on the same theme: anger, guilt, pleas for reconciliation. "You can't just erase me, Ethan," one voice snapped, her voice tight with frustration. "We're not done." Another, softer, almost broken, "Please, just talk to me. I didn't know." He listened to the first few, his thumb hovering over the reply button, but something stopped him. Not anger, not spite, but a quiet certainty that responding would pull him back into her orbit, and he wasn't ready for that. He wasn't sure he ever would be. The texts were relentless too, a cascade of words that ranged from accusatory to apologetic. "You lied to me for years. I'm sorry I didn't see you. How could you do this to us?" Ethan read them once, then stopped, letting them pile up like leaves in a neglected yard. When she showed up at Cole Ventures again, unannounced, he was in a meeting. Priya intercepted her, polite but firm, and Madison left in a huff, her heels echoing down the hall. Ethan thanked Priya with a nod, and she shrugged. "I've got your back, boss," she said. And that was that. He wasn't cruel, he didn't want to hurt her, but he was done being her anchor, her shadow, her safe bet. So he leaned into himself instead. He started hiking again, something he'd loved before marriage swallowed his weekends. The trails around Mount Rainier were his church now. Mossy paths, the crunch of gravel, the burn in his legs as he climbed. Up there, with the wind cutting through his jacket and the world spread out below, he felt clean, unburdened. He'd stand at a lookout, hands in his pockets, and let the silence speak. Yoga came next, a studio near the office where he went 3 times a week. The instructor, a wiry woman named Lena, had a no-nonsense warmth that put him at ease. "Breathe into it, Ethan," she'd say as he wobbled in warrior pose, and he'd smile, focusing on the stretch, the moment, the absence of expectation. Music followed, old vinyl records he'd collected in his 20s, rediscovered in a shop downtown, Coltrane, Davis, Simone. He'd sit in the apartment at night, a glass of bourbon in hand, letting the notes fill the space where Madison's voice used to be. Work remained his constant, but it was different now. He was more present, more engaged, as if a fog had lifted. His team noticed. Priya teased him about his new vibe, and the analysts started joking that he was gunning for another Forbes cover. Ethan laughed it off, but he felt it too. A spark he'd dimmed for too long reignited. The legal step came quietly, almost inevitably. He met with a lawyer, a calm woman named Rachel who specialized in amicable separations. "What do you want out of this?" she asked, her pen poised over a notepad. Ethan thought for a moment, the question heavier than it seemed. "Freedom," he said finally. "To be me, without fighting for it." Rachel nodded, and they drafted the papers. Divorce, clean and straightforward, no contest over assets. He didn't want the house, didn't want to claw for pieces of a life that no longer fit. He signed the forms in her office, the pen steady in his hand, and felt a weight lift. Madison's reaction was anything but quiet. When the papers arrived, her calls doubled, her texts a flood of disbelief. "You're serious? This is insane, Ethan, you don't mean it." She showed up at the apartment one evening, banging on the door until a neighbor poked their head out. Ethan let her in, not because he wanted to, but because he knew she wouldn't leave otherwise. She stood in the living room, arms crossed, eyes wild. "You're really doing this," she said, her voice shaking. "You're throwing away 15 years over what? A fight? A misunderstanding?" Ethan leaned against the counter, his calm a wall she couldn't breach. "It's not one fight, Madison. It's years of you deciding who I am and me letting you. I can't do it anymore." She stepped closer, her face softening, a tactic he recognized from 100 arguments. "I messed up, okay? I didn't see you, I get it, but we can fix this. We're us, Ethan. We're supposed to fight for this." He shook his head, not angry, just done. "I fought for us for years. You didn't notice. I'm not fighting anymore." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She left without another word, the door clicking shut behind her. Ethan stood there, the silence settling, and wrote in his journal, "She thinks it's about winning or losing. It's not. It's about living. I'm choosing that now, and she can't follow." The next morning he went for a run, the city waking around him, and felt lighter than he had in years. Madison's desperation was hers to carry now. Ethan was moving forward, one step at a time, toward a life that was finally his own. Ethan's life began to take on a new shape, one he hadn't anticipated but welcomed, like a long-lost friend. The corporate apartment, once a stopgap, was now a canvas for his rediscovery. He added touches that felt like him, a framed print of a Puget Sound sunset, a stack of dog-eared paperbacks, a small potted fern that thrived despite his novice care. Each choice, however small, was a declaration. This was his space, his time, his defiance. He started reaching out, not to fill the silence, but to reconnect with parts of himself he'd let fade. An old college friend, Sam, lived an hour away in Tacoma, running a craft brewery with his wife. Ethan drove down one Saturday, the highway stretching open and free. Sam greeted him with a bear hug, his beard flecked with gray, his laugh as loud as Ethan remembered. They spent the afternoon tasting IPAs, swapping stories about their 20s, late-night philosophy debates, road trips to nowhere, the kind of freedom that felt infinite back then. "You look different," Sam said, leaning on the bar, a pint in hand. "Not bad different. Like you're waking up." Ethan smiled, sipping his beer, the hoppy bite grounding him. "Feels like it," he said, and left it at that. He didn't need to explain. Sam got it, the way old friends do. The visit sparked others, a hike with a former coworker who'd moved to Olympia. Coffee with a grad school buddy now teaching at UW. Each connection was a thread, weaving him back to a version of himself he'd buried under years of compromise. He wasn't chasing nostalgia. He was reclaiming it, building something new from the pieces. Work took on a deeper purpose, too. Ethan started mentoring startups, volunteering with a local incubator that helped young entrepreneurs refine their pitches. He'd sit across from nervous founders, their eyes bright with ambition, and offer not just advice, but belief. "You've got the spark," he told a 20-something building a green tech app. "Trust it, but test it. Data's your friend." The kid nodded, scribbling notes, and Ethan felt a quiet pride, not in his own success, but in theirs. He began therapy, a step he'd resisted for years, thinking he could journal his way through anything. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Chen with a warm voice and sharp questions, met him in a cozy office near Pike Place. The first session was simple. She asked him to tell his story, and he did, haltingly at first. Then with a rush that surprised him. The fights, the silence, the weight of being unseen. Dr. Chen listened, her pen still, and when he finished, she said, "You've been carrying a lot alone. What would it feel like to let some of that go?" Ethan didn't have an answer then, but the question stayed with him, like a seed planted in soft soil. They met weekly, peeling back layers to sealing his fear of conflict, the way Madison's dismissal had echoed wounds he hadn't named. "You learn to shrink to fit her world," Dr. Chen said one day. "What happens when you take up your own space?" He started to find out, session by session, each one a step toward clarity. The road trip came on a whim, a long weekend in October when the air turned crisp and the mountains called. He rented a Jeep, packed a bag, and drove east, no itinerary, just a playlist of Springsteen and Neil Young. The Cascades gave way to open plains, then the jagged peaks of Idaho. He camped one night under stars so bright they felt like a promise, the fire crackling as he wrote in his journal. "I'm not running from her anymore, I'm running toward me. Whoever that is, I like him better already." Back in Seattle, he kept moving forward. He joined a book club, surprising himself by speaking up about The Alchemist, his voice steady as he talked about destiny and choice. He took a cooking class, laughing when his risotto turned to mush, the instructor clapping him on the back. Small moments, but they added up, each one a brick in a foundation he hadn't known he could build. Romance wasn't on his mind, not yet, but he felt the first stirrings of openness. A woman at the yoga studio, Jen, smiled at him one morning, her eyes crinkling with a warmth that caught him off guard. They chatted over smoothies after class, nothing heavy, just easy talk about trails and music. He didn't ask for her number, but he didn't rule it out either. The possibility was enough, a door left ajar, not forced open. Therapy helped him, naming gaslighting, the way Madison's words had twisted his sense of self. "You're not responsible for her choices," Dr. Chen said, and Ethan nodded, the truth settling like a stone. He wasn't angry anymore, not really, just ready to let go. The divorce papers were moving through the system, slow but steady, and he felt no urge to fight over details. The house, the savings, the memories, he'd take what he needed and leave the rest. One evening, alone in the apartment, he pulled out his journal and wrote, "I thought I'd lost myself, but I was here all along, waiting. This isn't the end of me, it's the beginning. I'm not afraid of it anymore." He closed the book, the city's light soft through the window, and felt something he hadn't in years: hope. Months had passed since Ethan last saw Madison, the distance between them now measured not just in miles but in the life he'd built without her. Spring had given way to a Seattle summer, the kind that felt like a gift. Clear skies, warm evenings, the city alive with festivals and open windows. Ethan's apartment was no longer a placeholder. It was home, filled with traces of his new rhythm. A guitar he was teaching himself to play, a stack of startup pitch decks on the coffee table, a photo from his Idaho road trip pinned to the fridge. He was different now. Not reinvented, but uncovered. The man he'd always been, free to breathe. Madison's calls had slowed, then stopped, the divorce proceedings moving forward with a mechanical inevitability. Ethan didn't gloat or grieve. He simply signed what was needed, his lawyer Rachel handling the rest. He'd kept in touch with his therapist, Dr. Chen, and their sessions less frequent but still vital, a space to process the quiet victories and lingering scars. "You're not just surviving," Dr. Chen had said recently. "You're choosing yourself. That's rare." Ethan had nodded, the words settling deep. It was a Tuesday evening, the sun low over the Sound, when Madison reappeared. Ethan was in his apartment, strumming chords on the guitar, the notes clumsy but earnest, when a knock broke the quiet. He opened the door to find her standing there, no longer the polished event planner but something raw, her hair loose, her eyes tired, a manila envelope clutched in her hands. She looked smaller, not defeated but diminished, like someone who'd run out of. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Ethan stepped aside, not because he owed her but because he was curious. Not about her but about himself, about what this moment would mean. She stood in the living room, glancing at the changes, the fern, the books, the life that didn't include her. "It's nice," she said, and there was no sarcasm, just a hollow attempt at connection. Ethan leaned against the counter, arms crossed, waiting. He didn't offer her a seat. Madison held up the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. "I wrote you something," she said. "I didn't know how else to do this. Just please read it." He took it, not breaking eye contact, and slid the letter out. Her handwriting was neat but urgent, the ink smudged in places, as if she'd hesitated before committing to the words. He read in silence, Madison watching, her breath shallow. The letter was a confession, one he hadn't seen coming. Early in their marriage, she wrote, she'd been pregnant, barely 8 weeks along, a secret she'd kept even from him. Scared, overwhelmed, unsure of their future, she'd chosen adoption, signing papers alone, telling herself it was for the best. "I didn't know how to tell you," the letter read. "I thought you'd hate me, or worse, that you'd stay out of duty. I couldn't face that." She'd carried the guilt for years, she said, and his leaving had brought it roaring back, a truth she couldn't outrun. Ethan's hand stilled on the page, his chest tight. He looked up at her, searching her face, but all he saw was fragility, not remorse. The grief hit him hard. Not just for the child he'd never known, but for the trust they'd lost long before this moment. "You didn't tell me," he said, his voice low, not accusing, just stating a fact. "Not then, not ever." Madison's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I was afraid," she whispered. "I thought I was protecting us." He shook his head, folding the letter carefully, his movements deliberate. "You were protecting yourself," he said, and there was no venom in it, just clarity. "You decided for both of us, just like always." She flinched but didn't argue. The silence stretched, heavy with what couldn't be undone. Ethan felt the weight of it, the child, the years, the life they might have had, but it didn't break him. It hurt, yes, but he was stronger now, rooted in something she couldn't touch. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally, his gaze steady. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Forgiveness maybe, or just for you to understand." He considered that, the idea of forgiveness, but it felt distant, like a word in someone else's language. "I don't hate you," he said, and he meant it. "But I can't carry this for you. Not anymore." She nodded, wiping her eyes, and turned to leave. At the door, she paused, looking back. "I'm sorry, Ethan, for everything." He didn't answer, and she walked out, the door closing softly behind her. Alone, Ethan sat on the couch, the letter in his hands. The grief was real, a sharp ache for a child he'd never known, but it wasn't despair. It was fuel. He called Rachel the next morning, his voice calm but resolute. "I need to look into something," he said. "Adoption records, early 2000s. Can you help?" Rachel promised to dig, to see what could be found, and Ethan thanked her, a new purpose settling in his chest. He opened his journal that night, the guitar resting nearby, and wrote, "She took something from me, but she didn't take everything. There's a piece of me out there, maybe, and I'll find it if I can, not for her, not for us, for me." He closed the book, the city humming beyond the window, and felt the stirrings of resolve, a path forward he hadn't planned but would walk anyway. Summer faded into a Seattle autumn, the leaves turning gold and crimson, the air sharp with the promise of change. Ethan had settled into his new life with a quiet confidence, each day a step further from the man he'd been. His apartment was a sanctuary now, filled with small joys, a worn copy of Mo Dick on the nightstand, a coffee maker that hissed just right, a view of the city that felt like a conversation. He was 42, starting over, and for the first time, that didn't scare him. The letter to his child was a weight he carried gently, not a burden but a purpose. He'd spent weeks drafting it, late at night when the city was still, the words coming slow but true. He didn't know if the child, grown now, maybe a teenager, would ever read it. Didn't even know if they could be found. Rachel, his lawyer, had warned him the search might lead nowhere. Adoption records from that era were often sealed tight. But Ethan wrote anyway, because it wasn't about the outcome. It was about the act, about claiming a piece of himself Madison had tried to erase. "Dear you," he began, the pen steady in his hand. "I didn't know about you until recently, and that's a grief I'll carry forever. But I'm here now, thinking of you, hoping you're safe, loved, happy. If you ever want to know me, I'm waiting. If not, that's okay too. Just know you're in my heart, always." He signed it simply, Ethan, and gave it to Rachel, who promised to file it with any open channels, a message in a bottle tossed into an uncertain sea. The process was slow, bureaucratic, but Ethan didn't rush it. He'd learned patience, not the kind that shrinks you, but the kind that grows you. He kept moving forward, his days full of work, friends, the small rituals that made him whole. Cole Ventures was thriving, the new app feature a hit with users. And Ethan's mentorship at the startup incubator had earned him a quiet reputation, not as a mogul but as a guide who listened. He liked that better. Therapy with Dr. Chen had tapered to monthly check-ins, a space to reflect rather than repair you. "You've built something real," she'd said at their last session, her smile warm. "Not just out there, but in here." He'd tapped her chest, and Ethan had nodded, feeling the truth of it. The scars were still there. Madison's words, the child he'd lost, but they weren't wounds anymore. They were part of him, like the lines on his face, proof of a life lived. The divorce finalized on a rainy morning in October, a court hearing that felt more like paperwork than reckoning. Ethan sat in the courtroom, his suit crisp but understated, Rachel at his side. Madison was there too, across the aisle, her eyes fixed on the judge. She looked smaller than he remembered, not broken but brittle, like something held together by will alone. When the gavel fell, declaring them free of each other, Ethan felt no triumph, no relief, just a quiet blankness, like turning the last page of a book. Madison caught his eye as they left, a flicker of something, regret maybe, or resignation. She opened her mouth, then closed it, and walked away, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Ethan watched her go, and for the first time he felt nothing, not anger, not sorrow, not even curiosity. She was a chapter closed, a story he no longer needed to read. He drove to Alki Beach that afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds, the water a restless gray. He carried a photo Rachel had found, a grainy image from an adoption agency's file, the only trace of the child that might be his. A baby, eyes wide, wrapped in a blanket. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Ethan stood at the edge of the shore, the wind tugging at his jacket, and looked at the photo, his thumb brushing the corner. He didn't know if he'd ever meet them, didn't know if they'd want him if he did. But standing there, with the waves crashing and the city humming behind him, he felt a peace he hadn't known was possible. He'd lost so much, love, trust, years of himself, but he'd found more, strength, clarity, a life that fit. He smiled softly, not at the photo but at the horizon, at the man he'd become. Ethan slipped the photo into his pocket and walked along the beach, his steps light, unhurried. The first was coming in, washing the sand clean, and he kept going, one foot in front of the other, toward whatever came next.